It has been 2 years since I picked up the iPhone 14 Pro, and I think it's about the time to talk about how it's been holding up. First off, I feel like smartphones in general have reached a point where upgrading every year just isn't necessary. And second, there really hasn't been a single upgrade that's made me feel like I need to replace the 14 Pro. The first thing I have to say is that it feels great in the hand. The stainless steel frame gives it that solid premium weight, but honestly after 2 years, I don't think it feels heavy at all. I've gone back and forth between using a case and going completely caseless, and surprisingly, it still looks really good. Sure, the frame has picked up its fair share of scratches, especially around the edges, but that's just what happens with stainless steel. The back glass though is basically flawless. I personally chose the 14 Pro over the 14 Pro Max because of its size. While the Pro Max models have a larger battery and a bigger screen, I prefer the more compact form factor of the 14 Pro. As much as I appreciate a big display, I've just never been a fan of phones that are too large. The 14 Pro feels like the sweet spot, comfortable to hold and easy to carry around. One thing I've really come to appreciate is the silent mode switch. It's something that's kind of overlooked in favor of the newer action button on models like the 15 Pro, but honestly, I prefer the tactical feel of the silent switch. It's quick, it's reliable, and it's just been part of the iPhone experience for so long. Now, what's really held up well is the screen. I've never used the screen protector on this phone, so it's been completely exposed for 2 years straight. And somehow, I don't have any deep scratches, just a few micro ones that you can only see at the right angle under bright light. The 120Hz Pro Motion display was a game changer when I first got it, and 2 years later, I can't imagine going back to 60Hz. Everything just feels smoother, scrolling, animations, even just swiping between apps. If you've never used the high refresh rate display, you might not think it's a big deal, but once you get used to it, it's impossible to go back. The OLED panel still looks incredible. Blacks are perfectly black, colors are super vibrant, and HDR content looks amazing. Even outdoors, the peak brightness still holds up. At 2000 nits, this screen gets plenty bright in direct sunlight, and I've never had an issue seeing anything. The one major regret I have is going for the 128GB storage option. At the time, I thought it would be more than enough for my needs, especially since I wasn't really into using the camera all that much. But now, after getting into ProRAW photos and shooting in 4K, I'm running out of space way quicker than I thought. Those 128GB fill up fast, ProRAW images are huge, and 4K videos eat up storage like crazy. I find myself constantly having to offload stuff or deleting older content just to make some room. I really should have opted for the 256GB or even 512GB model to future-proof myself for all the media that I'm capturing now. So that's definitely something you should consider when purchasing a new phone. When it comes down to performance, this thing still flies. The A16 Bionic chip hasn't shown any signs of slowing down. Apps open instantly, gaming is super smooth, and I never feel like I'm waiting on the phone. The 6GB of RAM is enough to keep apps running in the background without constantly reloading, which is great if you're multitasking a lot. When I first got the 14 Pro, the battery was solid. I could comfortably get through a full day without worrying about charging, but after 2 years, it's definitely not the same anymore. And honestly, that's totally normal, and it is something to be expected. My battery health is sitting at around 88%, and I've always somewhat taken care of the battery. I always try my best keeping it between 20% and 80%, and I never charge it during the night. It's not at the point where I have to upgrade, but it is definitely something to keep in mind if you're planning to hold on to this phone for a few more years. Alright, let's talk about the cameras, because this is one of the biggest reasons people upgrade. 2 years later, the 14 megapixel main sensor is still really good. Photos are sharp, colors look great, and Smart HDR does a solid job balancing highlights and shadows. But the real advantage here is Pro RAW. If you like editing your photos, the amount of detail you can pull out of a 48 megapixel Pro RAW image is insane. You can push colors, recover shadows, and still end up with a super clean image. If you don't edit your photos, you might not care as much, but for me, this has been one of my favorite features. The ultra-wide lens has been decent, it's great in good lighting, but in low light, it definitely starts to fall apart. And the 3x telephoto is solid, but I won't lie, I do find myself wanting a little bit more zoom sometimes. When it comes to video, the iPhone 14 Pro still delivers some of the best smartphone footage you can get. 4K recording is nice, but here's the issue. Due to my 128GB storage, I quickly ran into space limitations. I prefer recording in 4K, but I've had to drop down to 1080p for most of my videos to avoid constantly running out of space. Another downside I've noticed is that ProRes video only shoots in 1080p at 30fps, which is a bit limiting if you're looking for higher resolutions or frame rates for more professional work. I actually really like the dynamic island. It's super convenient for quickly accessing things like timers, screen recording, music, and even returning to calls. It's a small but useful addition that's really grown on me over time. The always on display is something I've actually never used. I always found it unnecessary, and honestly, I prefer having my phone completely off when I'm not using it. I get why some people like it, but for me, it's just never been a feature I felt the need to keep on. And finally, iOS updates. 2 years later, this phone is still getting all the latest iOS features, and realistically, it'll keep getting them for another 3 to 4 years. That's something Apple does really well, and it makes holding onto an older phone way easier. So, 2 years later, am I happy with the iPhone 14 Pro? Absolutely.